The first ball of the season at Hardcombe House began at 9, and by 10:30, Miss Prudence Vane had been standing at the same pillar for so long that the footman had stopped offering her lemonade. She was 31 years old. Her gown was a soft green muslin that had been retrimmed twice, once at the hem and once at the sleeves, and the second trimming did not quite match the first. She held her gloved hands loosely at her waist and watched the dancers turn under 200 candles, and she did not permit her face to move. Lady Marchbourne's voice carried the way a fan carries a scent, without effort and without apology. "The Vane girl is still here," she said to the woman beside her, not quite quietly, though one hesitates to say girl. "She has been coming to this ballroom for 13 years. At some point, a woman on the shelf ought to have the grace to stay on it." A woman on the shelf. Prudence heard it. So did the 4 people nearest the pillar, and one of them, a young man in a bottle-green coat, laughed into his glass and then arranged his face when he remembered she could see him. Her pulse moved in her throat. Her hands stayed exactly where they were, across the room. At the terrace doors, a tall man in a navy tailcoat had turned his head. He had been speaking to a gentleman about horses, or about the road from Kent, or about nothing at all. He stopped speaking. He looked at the pillar for the length of 3 breaths, and then he looked away again, and the gentleman beside him repeated his question twice before receiving an answer. Nobody saw it. Prudence did not see it. She was busy composing her face into the expression she had spent 13 years perfecting, the one that said she was quite comfortable, quite content, quite finished with wanting anything. What she did not yet know was that the man at the terrace doors had recognized her handwriting 6 weeks earlier, on a letter he was never meant to read. Her father had been the rector at Little Amsden until the winter he died, and Prudence had spent the years after his death in the household of her uncle, Sir Rowland Vane, who considered her presence a kindness he was owed thanks for daily. She rose at 6. She copied her uncle's correspondence in a hand so clear that his solicitor had once complimented it aloud, which had cost her a week of her uncle's coldness. She read to her aunt in the afternoons. She had £400 settled on her from her mother, which was not enough to marry on and not enough to live on, and which sat in the 3% like a small stone in her pocket, useful only for the knowledge that it existed. She had been pretty once. She was still, though the season had decided otherwise around her 26th year and had not revisited the verdict. Her hair was a dark brown that would not hold a fashionable curl. She had a mouth that went thin when she was thinking, and a habit of standing very still, and the still standing had been mistaken for 13 years, for having nothing to say. The wound she carried was not dramatic. It was a sentence spoken by her uncle in the 3rd year of her residence at a dinner where she had corrected a guest on a point of Latin, and been correct. "You must forgive my niece," he had said, smiling at the table. "She has an education and no prospects, and one of those is a misfortune." She had believed him. That was the whole of it. She had taken the sentence into herself and built her days around it. And every year that passed without an offer had confirmed it, and by 31, she no longer thought of it as an opinion. She thought of it as weather. If you have ever stood at the edge of a room and made yourself very small so that no one would have to notice you were there, stay with this one. She did not know what was coming. You might. The Duke of Ashcombe had come to Hardcombe House because his sister had asked him to, and because a duke who does not appear at the first ball of the season is a duke about whom people invent reasons. He was 38. He had inherited 11 years earlier, and had spent 9 of those years being, by universal agreement, the most correct and least interesting man in England. He danced twice a season. He gave to the parish. He said little and meant all of it. And mothers with daughters had long since learned to bring their hopes elsewhere. His name was Alistair. Very few people had used it in a decade. He crossed the ballroom that first night without stopping at the pillar. He spoke to Lady Marchbourne because she was his aunt by marriage, and because not speaking to her would have been a statement. He asked her, without particular emphasis, who the woman in the green gown might be. That? Lady Marchbourne's fan rose half an inch. Sir Rowland Vane's niece. The one who copies his letters. "A woman on the shelf, your grace." and quite settled there. He did not answer. His hand went briefly to his coat, to the left breast, the way a man checks that a thing is still where he left it. Then he asked about the weather in Sussex. 3 days later, the season delivered Prudence to the Marchbourne morning room, because her aunt had a card, and her aunt required an arm. Prudence sat where she was placed, beside a window slightly behind the chairs that mattered, and she was so successfully invisible that the conversation forgot to lower itself. Miss Cecilia Fenwick was 20. She had been the diamond of the previous season, and had not yet been dislodged, and she sat at Lady Marchbourne's right hand in ice-blue silk, with a string of small pearls at her throat, and an ease in her shoulders that came from 20 years of being the correct answer to every question. "They say His Grace asked after someone at Hartcombe," Cecilia said. "He asked after a curiosity," Lady Marchbourne said. "Men of his rank collect oddities the way they collect prints. It signifies nothing." Prudence looked at the window. In the glass, she could see her own reflection laid over the garden, and she watched it hold perfectly still, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she had become an oddity, in a room where she had once been a girl in a white gown waiting to be asked to dance. She had not cried about any of it in 11 years. She did not intend to start in the Marchbourne morning room. The Duke of Ashcombe arrived at 4, which was not the hour for calling, and which meant that he had come from somewhere, and had not gone home first. There was rain on his shoulders. He stood in the doorway, and the room reorganized itself around him, chairs turning, Cecilia's chin lifting by a quarter inch, Lady Marchbourne rising with the practiced grace of a woman who had risen for dukes all her life. He greeted them. He accepted tea. He did not drink. And then he walked past the arranged chairs, past the ice-blue silk, to the window, where a woman in a retrimmed green gown was sitting with her hands in her lap. And he said, "Miss Vane." "You are in a draught." Prudence looked up. "I am quite comfortable, Your Grace. You are not." He moved, and the movement was so economical that it took her a moment to understand that he had put himself between her and the window. "Sit nearer the fire." It was a command. It was not a request, and it was delivered in the flat, level voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed by grooms and stewards and members of the House of Lords. And Prudence felt the heat come up her neck, and hated it, because she knew exactly what this was. He had seen a shabby woman in a draught, and had felt the reflex of the well-bred. It was charity, with a title on it. She did not move nearer the fire. She looked at his hands instead, because looking at his face was more than she could manage, and she saw that one of them was closed, and that the closed hand rested against his coat over the left breast, and that he was not aware he was doing it. He stayed 4 minutes, he asked her nothing, he left, and Cecilia laughed. And Lady Marchbourne said something about draughts and about how kind His Grace was to the unfortunate, and Prudence's pulse did not settle for an hour. That was the first deposit. There would be a great many, and she would misread every one. The letter had come to Ashcombe House in the last week of February, folded inside a bundle of parish accounts from Little Amsden, where the Duke held the living and had for 11 years never once visited. It was a copy, made in a clear, round hand, of a petition from the parish widows regarding the coal allowance. At the bottom, in the same hand, someone had added a line the petition had not asked for. Mrs. Savantin. Hobbs cannot write and would not have anyone know it. So I have set down her words as she spoke them, and not as I would have written them. They are better than mine. There was no signature. There was instead a small ink smudge at the lower corner, where a hand had rested too long, and the Duke of Ashcombe had sat with that page for a very long time on a Tuesday afternoon in February, and had then written to his steward asking who kept the parish books at Little Amsden. The answer had come back within the week. Sir Rowland's niece did the copying as she had done for 6 years, without payment, because her uncle held the churchwarden's office and found the labor beneath him. The Duke had read that letter twice. Then he had put it in his coat, over the left breast, where a thing had been carried before, and where nothing had been carried since. The season ground forward. There were dinners at which Prudence was seated below, the salt and above nobody, and mornings at which she copied her uncle's correspondence until her fingers cramped, and one evening at the Pemberton rout, when she found the Duke of Ashcombe standing at a bookcase looking at nothing, and he said, "You did not eat." And he said, "Eat something," and walked away. And a plate arrived at her elbow 6 minutes later, carried by a footman who did not know who had sent it. The Pemberton rout was the 4th evening in 9 days, on which the Duke of Ashcombe appeared at an entertainment he had no reputation for attending. Mrs. Murray. Pemberton was so undone by the honor that she moved 2 card tables and a pianoforte to make a path from the door to the fire, and the Duke walked past the path and stood at a bookcase in the corner for 40 minutes with a volume of sermons he did not open. Prudence had been given the task of keeping her aunt's shawl and her aunt's place, which meant standing behind a chair for 2 hours in a room where 26 people knew her name and none of them used it. She had eaten nothing since a slice of bread at 8 that morning, because eating at these things required a plate, and a plate required a hand free, and a hand free required someone to hold the shawl. He crossed to the bookcase, where she had been sent to fetch a novel her aunt had decided at 10 o'clock that she wanted. "You did not eat," he said. She did not look up from the shelf. "I am not hungry, Your Grace. Eat something." It was 4 syllables. He said it to the bookcase, not to her, and then he walked away, and Prudence stood with her hand on the spine of a book she no longer had any interest in, and felt the flat insult of being managed by a man who had decided she was a problem of housekeeping. The plate arrived 6 minutes later. A footman brought it, put it on the small table at her elbow, and went away without a word, and there was cold chicken on it, and bread, and a slice of the raised pie that had been at the far end of the supper room where she had not been able to go. She ate it standing up, behind her aunt's chair, and she was angrier while she ate it than she had been in a year, and she ate all of it. Later she understood that he had watched her from the bookcase to see whether she would. She had not looked. She had felt it on the side of her face for 4 minutes, and had told herself it was the candles. Her body knew where he was in a room. This was the humiliating part. She could be facing a wall, deep in a conversation about her aunt's rheumatism, and she would know that he had entered, and her skin would know it before her mind consented, and she would despise herself quietly for the rest of the evening. Her mind, meanwhile, was busy with the only explanation her wound would permit. He was bored. He was correct, and he was bored, and she was a curiosity, exactly as Lady Marchbourne had said, and the moment she permitted herself to imagine otherwise, she would become the thing she had spent 13 years refusing to be, which was a woman who hoped in public. In the 2nd week of May, Prudence did a thing she had no reason to do, and every reason not to. Her uncle had been approached by a builder regarding the parish land at Little Amsden, 3 acres of common ground where 11 cottagers had grazed geese and cut turf since before anyone could remember, and the enclosure was legal and the compensation was fair by the standard of the men who set the standard, and Sir Rowland had asked his niece to copy the agreement in her clear hand, so it might be sent to the Duke's steward for the ducal signature. She copied it. She copied every word of it correctly, because her father had taught her that a clerk who improves a document is a liar with better handwriting, and she did not alter so much as a comma of the builder's arithmetic. Took her 2 hours. Somewhere in the 2nd hour she came to the schedule of the 3 acres, and the schedule named the ground by its old parish name, Goose Green, and she stopped with the pen above the paper and did not write for a long while. She had known Goose Green her whole childhood. Her father had walked her across it on Sunday afternoons and named the cottages in order the way other men named their horses. First from the lane, the Ashbys. Second, Old Pike, who mended chairs. Third, empty, since the year of the bad harvest. Fourth, Mrs. Hubbs, who was 74 now, and who had put a warm hand on the back of a rector's daughter's neck at that rector's funeral, and had said nothing at all, which had been the only bearable thing anyone did that week. The compensation in the schedule came to £4 a household. Mrs. Hubbs cut her turf on that green. Without it, she would buy coal, and coal at Little Amsden was 11 shillings the load, and 11 shillings was what she had in the world between Michaelmas and Lady Day. Prudence finished the copy. Ooh. She blotted it, and folded it, and set it on her uncle's tray for the morning post, exactly as she had been told. Then she took a fresh sheet from the back of the drawer, one of her own, bought with her own money, and she began again. It took her 4 evenings. She worked after the house was asleep, at the little table by her window with 1 candle, because 2 candles would have been noticed and a noticed candle would have required an explanation. She set down what the 11 cottagers actually held and had held and would lose. She wrote out the names. She wrote out the ages. She wrote out the turf rights and the goose rights and the years each family had been on that ground. And where she was not certain of a year, she wrote that she was not certain, because a document that overstates once is a document that is dismissed entirely. At the bottom she wrote nothing about herself. On the 4th night, the candle guttered at about 2, and she sat in the dark for a moment with her fingers cramped into a claw around the pen, and she thought quite clearly that she was doing a foolish thing, that she had no standing, no name, no right, and that a duke's steward would put her 4 evenings in a file and never open it. She sealed it anyway. In the morning, she walked the 1.5 miles to the receiving office herself, rather than put it in her uncle's bag, and she paid the postage out of the small stone in her pocket, and the clerk took it without looking at her, and she walked back and copied her uncle's correspondence until noon. She did not sign that one, either. She did not sign that one, either. Her uncle found out. Of course he found out, because the steward was thorough. And the steward rode back to Sir Rowland, asking about the second enclosure. And Sir Rowland stood in his own library, with the letter in his fist, and said things to his niece that a man says when he has been embarrassed in front of money. "You have an education, and no prospects," he said at the end of it, breathing hard. "And by God, Prudence, one of them is a misfortune, and I am beginning to think it is not the second." She stood very still. She said, "The names are correct, sir. I checked them twice." What she did not know was that the Duke of Ashcombe had been in the corridor. He had come to Sir Rowland's house at an hour that was not the hour for calling, on a matter of parish business that could have been settled by letter, and he had been left to wait in a corridor by a butler who had not expected him, and he had heard a woman with nothing at all in the world refuse to unsay a true thing to the man who fed her. He did not go in. He stood there with his hat in his hands, and his face still as ice over a river. And he listened to the whole of it, and when the library door opened, he had already stepped back into the hall and arranged himself as a man who had just arrived. That night at Ashcombe House he took the folded page from his coat, the one with the smudge in the corner, and set it on the desk beside a small portrait miniature that had been turned to the wall for 9 years, and he turned the miniature around. Charlotte, Duchess of Ashcombe, had been 23 when she died, and she had died of a fever she took. In a cottage row at Ashcombe village where she had gone, against his stated wish and without his knowledge, to sit with a laundress's children. He had been in London, he had been correct and busy, and certain that a duchess had people for that, and he had told her so in a letter. She had answered with 2 words and a joke, and she had been buried before the letter reached him. He had spent 9 years believing that his correctness had killed her. He had not turned the portrait around in all that time, because he could not look at her face and hold that thought at once. He named it to no one. He named it once, alone, in a study, at 2 in the morning, and then he put the miniature in his coat over the left breast, where the folded page had been, and carried both. If you have ever kept a small thing in a pocket for years because putting it down would mean admitting what it cost you, you already know what he did next. He did nothing at all, for 11 days. The season, meanwhile, had found a use for Prudence Vane. Lady Marchbourne had a nephew, Mr. Prala. Julian Crail was 44, a widower, with a fine sense of his own patience, and he had lately come into a small property in Hertfordshire, which he considered inadequate to his merits. He required a wife who would keep his books and make no trouble, and Lady Marchbourne, who protected the order she had been raised inside the way other women protect their linen, had determined that a woman on the shelf who copied letters for nothing would be grateful. The proposal was made in Sir Rowland's drawing-room with Sir Rowland present, which is not how proposals are made when the woman's answer is thought to be in doubt. Prudence was sent for at 11 in the morning and told to change her gown, which was how she knew before she reached the stairs. Her aunt had put out the gray. Prudence looked at the gray laid on the bed and put on the green, because the green was hers and the gray had been her aunt's, and it was the only sentence she had available to her that morning. Mr. Combley. Crail spoke for 11 minutes about the advantages. He mentioned her age twice, gently, the way one mentions a stain on a carpet one is prepared to overlook. He mentioned her 400 pounds once, less gently. He said he understood she had a facility with correspondence, and that this was a quality he valued in a wife more than beauty, which he said with a small bow, as though he had paid her something. He had a way of pausing after each advantage to allow her to feel it. He described the property in Hertfordshire. He described the number of rooms, and the state of the roof, and the character of the neighborhood, which was quiet, he said, and would suit her. He described his first wife briefly and with real feeling as a woman who had kept excellent books, and Prudence understood that she had just been given the highest reference in his possession. He mentioned her age twice, gently, the way one mentions a stain on a carpet one is prepared to overlook. He mentioned her 400 pounds once, less gently, and named the figure aloud, in front of her uncle, as one names a quantity of coal. He said he understood she had a facility with correspondence, and that this was a quality he valued in a wife more than beauty, which he said with a small bow, as though he had paid her something. A fly moved on the window behind him. Prudence watched it for the length of a sentence about the roof. She was aware that the offer was not unreasonable. That was the part that pressed on her chest. Mr. Card. Wad Crail was not cruel, and he was not a fool, and he would not beat her or gamble her 400 pounds or shout at her across a table, and he was offering her the only thing the world had left on the table for a woman of 31 with an education and no prospects, and he was offering it in good faith, and he believed himself generous. And he was very nearly right. Prudence sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the carpet and felt, distantly, the specific cold that comes when a door you did not know was open is shut. "You are very kind, sir," she said. "I must ask for time." Sir Rowland's face did a thing. "She will not require much of it," he said. That night, her aunt came to her room with a candle and sat on the edge of the bed and told her, not unkindly, that she was 31, and that there would not be another, and that a woman on the shelf who refused a respectable offer would find the shelf a great deal narrower. Afterward, her aunt's hand was warm on her wrist. That was the cruelest part of it, that the hand was warm. Prudence did not answer. After the candle went away, she sat up in the dark until the window turned gray, and she thought about geese and turf and Mrs. Hobbs and about a man in a doorway saying, "Eat something." And she put that last thought away with the force of 11 years of practice. The Marchbourne ball was fixed for the 8th of June. It was to be, everyone understood, the ball at which Miss Fenwick's engagement to the Duke of Ashcombe would be announced, because Lady Marchbourne had said so in 6 drawing-rooms, and because no one had contradicted her, and because a Duke of 38 who has been correct for 11 years is a man in want of a duchess, whether he knows it or not. Prudence was invited. She was invited precisely because she was to be there when it happened, and because Mr. Crail would be there, and because Lady Marchbourne understood the arithmetic of the evening perfectly. A woman watching a duke choose a girl of 20 is a woman who will accept a widower of 44 by morning. She wore the green muslin. She had nothing else. The ballroom at Marchbourne House was the same ballroom as Hartcombe, in every way that mattered. 200 candles, an orchestra of 9. Terrace doors standing open onto a stone balustrade and a garden going blue in the dusk. Prudence took her place at a pillar, because pillars were where she lived. The pillar at Marchbourne House was marble and cold, through muslin at the shoulder, and it stood 4 feet from the door to the supper room, which meant that for 3 hours she would be brushed past by every servant carrying every dish, and would be, in the language of the room, exactly where she belonged. She watched it fill. She had watched 13 years of ballrooms fill, and had developed the only skill her position permitted, which was accuracy. She could tell you what a room cost. She could tell you that the Marchborn candles were wax and not tallow, 400 of them, at a price that would have kept 11 cottages in coal until March, and she noticed the arithmetic without bitterness, the way a carpenter notices a joint. The orchestra of 9 tuned. The terrace door stood open onto a stone balustrade, and a garden going blue in the dusk. The June air came in over the heat of the candles and made the flames lean all together toward the room. Cecilia came in on Lady Marchborn's arm in white and diamonds, and the room made the sound rooms make, and Prudence made her face very still. Lady Marchborn came to her at 9:30. She came deliberately, with 3 women in her wake, and she stopped in front of Prudence and looked her over from hem to hair with an expression of gentle regret, and she said loudly enough for 11 people, "Miss Vane, how good of you to come. A woman on the shelf so rarely troubles herself with the ball, and yet here you are, in green again. Mr. Crail is by the card-room. He has been very patient." There was a small noise from the group behind her. Not a laugh, worse than a laugh. The sound of people arranging their faces. Prudence said, "Thank you, my lady." Her pulse was in her throat, and her hands were loose at her waist, and her face did not move. And if you had been standing 6 feet away, you would have said she felt nothing at all. She left the ballroom. She went out through the terrace doors to the balustrade, and put both hands flat on the cold stone, and looked at the garden and breathed. Once, all the way in, the dark moment was not the mockery. She had survived 13 years of mockery, and had the calluses to prove it. The dark moment was the thing that came to her on that balustrade with the orchestra behind her and the geese and the turf and the 11 cottagers arranged in her clear round hand, somewhere in a steward's file, which was this: she had done the one brave thing of her life in secret, unsigned, and no one would ever know it was hers. Crail in September and copy his books for 30 years and die in Hertfordshire. And the small stone in her pocket would go to his nephews. She thought of the 4 evenings and the 1 candle, and her fingers cramped around the pen at 2 in the morning, and she thought, with the first real bitterness of her adult life, that she had spent them on people who would never know her name, for a man who would sign the paper at the top of the stairs tonight and marry a girl of 20 in September. She had built a life out of not wanting. She had been good at it. She had made an architecture of it. 13 years of scaffolding, the still hands, and the level voice and the face that did not move, and she had believed the architecture was her. And here at the end of it she found that she had wanted, all along and quite badly, and that the wanting had simply been kept in a room she never entered. Her chest hurt. Her hands were flat on cold stone in June, and her chest hurt, and behind her the orchestra was playing a country dance she had known the steps of since she was 17. She said it out loud once to the garden because there was no one to hear it. "I should have liked to be chosen." Behind her in the ballroom the orchestra finished a set. In the silence, Lady Marchborn's voice rose to make an announcement, and the room turned toward the top of the room where a girl in white was standing, and the Duke of Ashcombe was not standing beside her. He was at the terrace doors. Prudence turned, and he was there 6 feet away, and he had heard her, and she knew he had heard her, because his face had stopped being still. "Miss Vane," he said. "Your Grace." Her voice came out even. She was proud of that. Afterward, the 11 years of practice, earning her that one even syllable. "You are wanted inside. I am aware of what I am wanted for." He looked at her for a long moment. His hand went to his coat, to the left breast, and stopped there. "Mrs. Hobbs keeps 3 geese. Her cottage is the 4th from the lane. She cannot write, and would not have anyone know it." The stone of the balustrade was under her palms. She could not feel it. "I do not know what you mean," she said. Prudence, her given name. In his voice for the first time she had not heard it spoken with any warmth in 6 years. Her aunt said, "Prudence," the way one says a chore. Her uncle said it as a preface to a correction. This man said it once, quietly, on a balcony. And 11 years of weather came apart in her chest, and she could not do a thing about her face. "I have carried your handwriting in my coat since February," he said, the words level, "because it was the first honest thing that had come into my house in 9 years. I did not know your name. I know it now." "February," she said. Her voice had stopped being even. "The coal allowance." "The coal allowance," he agreed. "You set down a widow's words, and would not put your own name under them, and you paid the postage yourself, because it did not go in your uncle's bag." Bramwell established that in March it took him 9 days. She had been standing very still for 13 years, and she found that she could not manage it now. Her hands had come off the stone. She did not know when. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. In the ballroom behind them, a voice was saying something about the honor of the house. "Because I have spent 9 years being correct," he said, "and a woman I had never met spent 4 evenings of her own candles being kind, and I have not been able to hold both of those in my head at once since February." He did not touch her. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the June air, close enough to smell the rain still on his coat and the smoke of the ballroom in the wool, and he did not touch her. Her heart was going in her throat, where she could hear it. Her breath had gone shallow and useless. Every part of her that had been trained for 13 years to hold still was in open revolt. Her hands, her chest, the backs of her knees, and she understood with a lurch that he was waiting, and that the waiting was the most respectful thing anyone had ever done for her. She lifted her hand. She meant to steady herself. That was the lie, she told herself as it went up, and it went up anyway, and it got as far as his lapel, 3 inches from the coat where the folded page lived, and stopped. His breath stopped with it. She heard that. She heard a Duke of 38 stop breathing on a balcony because a spinster's hand had come within 3 inches of his coat, and something in her that had been dead for 11 years turned over and opened its eyes. Neither of them moved. The orchestra started again inside. "They are announcing an engagement," she said. "Yes," he said, "they are." And he offered her his arm. She should have refused. Every year of her life said refuse, said stay on the balcony, said do not walk into that room on this man's arm, and be the joke of the season for a second time in one night. She looked at his forearm in navy wool, and she thought of a woman of 74, with 3 geese, and she put her gloved hand on it. They came through the terrace doors together. It took the room 11 seconds to understand. The orchestra played on for 4 of them before the first violin faltered. Lady Marchbourne stood at the top of the room with her hand raised and her mouth open, on a sentence she had been composing for 6 weeks, and Cecilia stood beside her in white and diamonds, and 200 candles burned. And every face in that ballroom turned toward the terrace doors, where the Duke of Ashcombe was walking, a woman in a retrimmed green gown into the center of the floor. He did not hurry. That was the thing people spoke of afterward, that he did not hurry. He crossed the ballroom the way he did everything, at his own pace with his own arithmetic finished long before. The floor at Marchbourne House was 40 feet across, and he took it in the time it takes to say a paternoster, and the crowd opened in front of him because crowds do, and closed behind them because crowds do that as well. Prudence walked at his side in a green muslin gown retrimmed twice, past Mrs. Pemberton, who had made a path for him 9 days ago and got nothing for it. Past the young man in the bottle-green coat who had laughed into his glass at Hartcombe House in April, and who was not laughing now, past 400 wax candles leaning all together in the draught from the terrace doors. Her hand was on his forearm. She could feel the wool and the arm under the wool and nothing else in the world. And her face, which had not moved in 13 years, was doing something she could not have described and could not stop. She did not look at the floor. That was hers, and it cost her everything she had, and she kept her chin exactly level all 40 feet. He stopped in the center of the floor. He let go of her arm and turned and faced the top of the room, and in the silence he said one sentence: "Miss Vane has consented to be my wife." Nobody moved. Lady Marchbourne's fan came down. It did not snap shut. It simply came down, all the way down, and hung at the end of her wrist, and her mouth worked once around a word that did not arrive. She said, "Your Grace, the arrangement," and stopped, and said, "We had an understanding," and stopped again. And the third time she did not manage a sentence at all. She stood in her own ballroom with her hand on the back of a chair, and her hand was not steady. and every person in that room watched a woman who had never in her life said a thing she had not planned discover that there was nothing to be said. The Duke of Ashcombe did not look at her. That was his mercy, and it was calculated. And it was exactly enough. He did not name her. He did not name Mr. Day. Crail, who had come out of the card room and was standing very still by the door with a hand of whist still in his fingers, he did not say a second sentence. A second sentence would have been cruelty, and he had come to displace his aunt, not to break her. The room's silence broke from the back. An old woman near the orchestra, Lady Pemberton, who was 80 and past caring, said clearly, "Well done, Ashcombe." And somebody near the terrace doors laughed with the specific relief of a person who has been waiting years for something to be admitted. And then his steward, Mr. Bramwell, who had been standing by the terrace doors for an hour, and whom nobody had noticed because nobody notices a steward, stepped forward with a leather case under his arm, and said to the room and to nobody, "The settlement was signed on Thursday, my lady. Sir Rowland's consent is in it." Cecilia's chin came down. She looked at Prudence for a long moment across the floor, and something in her 20-year-old face went through a door and came out the other side, and she was the first person in the room to curtsy. Prudence stood in the middle of 200 candles with her hands loose at her waist, and her face not still at all, and did not gloat, and did not weep, and could not for the life of her remember what one did with one's hands. He put the miniature into her palm before the carriage on the steps in the dark. "Her name was Charlotte," he said. "She died of a fever she took sitting with a laundress's children, and I was in London telling her by letter that a duchess has people for that. I have not turned her face to the room in 9 years. His voice was level. It was not steady. "In February, a woman I had never met sent me a widow's words and would not sign them. I have not been able to think of anything else since." Prudence closed her hand around the miniature. It was warm from his coat. "I am 31, she said. "You should know that I heard what they call me. I have heard it for years. I know what they call you," he said. "I know what you are. Those are not the same, and only one of them is my business." She looked up at him. The lamp on the carriage was behind his head, and his face was in shadow, and she could not read it, and she found that she did not need to, and that this was the strangest sensation of her life. "Say it again," she said. "Prudence," he said. "They were married in the last week of August at Little Amsden, in her father's church, by a vicar who had baptized her. There were 40 people. Mrs. Hobbs sat in the third pew in a bonnet. She had trimmed herself and cried straight through the vows, and made no apology for it. Sir Rowland attended and was seated where he could be seen and not heard, which was a kindness he did not recognize as one. Lady Marchbourne did not attend. She wrote. 6 weeks later, a letter of 2 sentences that was as near to an apology as her whole education permitted, and Prudence answered it kindly, which cost her something, and which she did anyway. The enclosure at Little Amsden did not proceed. 3 acres of common ground stayed common. 11 cottagers kept their turf and their geese, and the Duke's steward entered the reason in the parish book in his own hand, which read, "At the Duchess's instance." The first snow came to Ashcombe in the 2nd week of December. Prudence sat in the small library at the east end of the house, the one with the bad chimney that nobody used, because it caught the afternoon light, and because she had claimed it in her first week and no one had thought to argue. There was a fire. There were parish books open on the table in front of her, but coal allowance for the winter, the widow's list, 41 names in her clear, round hand, and she had been at them since 2, and had lost the hour entirely. The door opened. He came in with snow on his shoulders, and stood there a moment without speaking, which was the thing he did instead of announcing himself. "You have not eaten," he said. "I am not hungry." "Eat something," she laughed. It surprised them both. He had not heard her laugh often, and his face, for the length of a breath, did something almost like amusement, and Prudence looked up from 41 names and thought that she would spend the rest of her life collecting that expression the way other women collect prints. He sat down across from her in the chair, with the split leather that she had refused to have mended. Because she liked it. He did not ask what she was doing. He had not asked once in 4 months what she was doing, and the not asking was the whole of his character rendered in a single habit, and she had come to understand it as the deepest compliment available in the English language. He picked up the second book. He began checking her arithmetic, badly moving his finger down, a column of shillings like a boy at a lesson, and she let him. Twice he found an error that was not an error, and she said nothing and let him find it again. The fire moved. Somewhere below them a door closed, and a dog complained about it. 41, he said at last. 41, she agreed. Mrs. Hobbs is the fourth from the lane. I know where Mrs. Hobbs is, he said. I have been made to know. It was not quite a joke. It was the nearest thing to one that he had produced in 9 years, and Prudence bent her head over the widow's list so that he would not see what her mouth was doing, and let a full minute of the afternoon go by in silence, and was warm all the way through. On the mantel, propped against the clock where the afternoon light reached it, the small portrait of a girl of 23 faced the room. Outside the window, the snow came down on the 3 acres of common ground, and on the 4th cottage from the lane, and on a woman of 74 with 3 geese, and the fire moved in the grate, and the pen went on in the clear round hand, and nobody in that room was waiting to be chosen. Thank you for staying until the end.